Chapter 3. The Metaphysics of Money. To mention money and metaphysics in the same sentence is to invite any number of misunderstandings. The hoary habit of thinking that walls off philosophical questions in a ghetto of abstractions apart from the world of ordinary life gets in the way of clarity here as so often. But there's an even more basic problem. Most people these days have no clear notion of what the word metaphysics means in the first place. The tangled history of the word probably makes that inevitable. A nameless librarian in ancient Alexandria first coined it out of sheer desperation while cataloging the works of Aristotle. Most of the treatises got names based on their subject matter: physics, meteorology, poetics, and so on. But one difficult treatise was labeled simply metaphysics, the stuff that comes after the physics. Then, as the famous fourth-grade history paper put it, some other stuff happened. The Library of Alexandria burned, Rome fell, what was left of the classical world got tipped into history's dumpsters by a band of helpful Visigoths, and so on. When the dust finally cleared, Aristotle was very nearly the only systematic ancient thinker whose works were still available in the Western world, and so he became, in Dante's words, master of those who know. That meant, among other things, that the labels assigned to his treatise by that anonymous Alexandrian savant became the basic categories of scholarship in the Middle Ages. Most of them remain basic categories today, which is why your local university has departments of physics, meteorology, and so on. Metaphysics was no exception, and the philosophical issues Aristotle tackled in that treatise have carried that label ever since. Those issues are what Aristotle himself called first philosophy, an analysis of the basic terms that have to be sorted out before any kind of philosophy can be sure of its foundations. The medieval scholars who blew the dust off Aristotle's treatise, however, interpreted his work in their own way, which meant that the basic issues of philosophy were redefined in terms of Christian, Muslim, or Jewish theology. By the time the 18th century rolled around, metaphysics as a discipline was almost entirely identified with the theological basis given it by the scholars of the Middle Ages, and so it got dropped like a hot potato as secularism swept the academic world. By the end of the 19th century, even theologians had stopped doing metaphysics in the old style, and most of the people practicing what used to be called metaphysics weren't using the word. At that point, in a final display of history's twisted sense of humor, the word got picked up by the American folk religious movement ancestral to today's New Age scene, and turned into a label for their own beliefs. The town in southern Oregon, where I used to live, has a metaphysical library, which even had a few books on metaphysics in the philosophical sense of the word. Though how they got there, I have no idea. The vast majority of the books were on past lives, channeled entities, flying saucers, evil conspiracies, and the rest of the mental furniture of contemporary alternative culture. Thus, it's probably necessary to point out that when I mention the metaphysics of money, I'm not referring to claims that money was invented by a conspiracy of evil space lizards, or that you can get as much money as you want by convincing yourself that money really, really loves you and wants to bed down in your wallet. You can find books making both these claims at the library just mentioned, as it happens, but both beliefs and a good many statements less obviously absurd are in large part produced by a failure to engage in the other kind of metaphysics, the thoughtful consideration of the basic categories of thought itself. Metaphysics, the thoughtful consideration of the basic categories of thought itself. That sort of analysis seems very abstruse and impractical until you notice the consequences of ignoring it. Sweeping claims are being made these days about whether certain things exist or do not exist, for example, by people who never seem to have examined their own presuppositions about what it means to exist and how a thing can be known to exist. The ongoing squabble between atheists of the Richard Dawkins stripe and their religious critics is perhaps the best-known example of this. Both sides are talking past each other because neither has grappled with the implications of its own metaphysical claims. That's the problem with the ghettoizing of philosophy mentioned earlier. The philosophical issues you ignore can sneak up on you while you're not looking, and turn your best attempts at thinking into gibberish. The point of contact between metaphysics and money is precisely the need to be sure of the meaning of the basic concepts too often taken for granted. There are several reasons why you can reliably get better economic advice from a randomly chosen fortune cookie at your local Asian buffet than from the most prestigious contemporary economists. As Chapter 1 pointed out, the fact that offering bad advice very often becomes a ticket to career success in economics is certainly a factor, and so are the influences discussed a little later in that same chapter, the assumption that economics can be understood apart from the non-economic factors that shape them, the faith in the existence and omnipotence of free markets, the insidious distortions caused by faked statistics, and the impact of paradigms and superstitions. Chapter 1 also mentioned the impact of premature mathematical formulations on economics, and that habit requires a second look at this point. As a barrier to clear thought, it's far from unique to economics. In one way or another, it underlies a great many of the mistakes that are tipping our own civilization toward the same dumpster that received the ruins of Rome. But it stands out in the field of economics with particular clarity. Its roots are in a metaphysical era which might as well be called, after one of its most influential practitioners, Descartes' fallacy. René Descartes is famous nowadays for saying, "I think, therefore I am." Few people these days take time to find out what he meant by that statement, and fewer still catch onto the radical project that underlay it. Without too much inaccuracy, Descartes can be called the first modern thinker. Certainly he was the first to embrace what has become an automatic presupposition of modern thought, the notion of the individual self as an isolated, independent witness whose thoughts and experiences are entirely its own. What existed to Descartes was limited to what he could know, and know precisely, with the same exactness as a geometrical proof. Descartes was arguing, in effect, that to be means the same thing as to be known, and to be known, in turn, equals to be precisely defined. It's clear that he recognized and intended the sweeping implications of this metaphysical stance. It's equally clear that a great many of the people who unknowingly follow his lead nowadays either accept those implications uncritically or have never noticed their existence. In the hands of much of modern science in particular, Descartes' equation has been blended with a passion for quantitative measurement to produce an even more extreme form of the same logic. To a great many scientists today, what exists is limited to what can be known. What can be known is limited to what can be measured, and what can be measured is treated as though it was identical to its measurements. You can get away with this in physics and still do excellent science. The objects studied by physics follow patterns that can be modeled effectively by mathematics, and most of them are so remote from ordinary human experience that anything about them that can't be easily measured can be ignored without too much trouble. Try doing this in a science closer to the realm of everyday human life, on the other hand, and you can count on running into trouble, because in that realm, Descartes' approach is usually a bad idea, and the modern scientific expansion of it is an even worse one. What can be measured is only a subset of what can be known, and what can be known, at least in any given situation, is only a subset of what exists. Nor does the fact that some properties of a thing can be measured according to some numerical scale prevent it from having other properties, at least as important, that are not subject to that kind of measurement. Logic that treats quantitative measurements as the only things that really exist is pervasive in the sciences, but its grip is even tighter on those fields of study that want to claim the prestige of science but can't quite pass muster. Economics is the poster child for this noxious effect. Down through the generations, against the sound advice of its best practitioners, economists have consistently treated the one thing in their field that can easily and consistently be measured with numbers, money, as though it was the one thing that matters. It's easy to see how seductive this habit can be, since it seems to allow everything to be measured on a common scale. The problem, of course, is that everything that can't be flattened out onto that common scale gets mislaid, and as often as not, these mislaid factors prove to be decisive. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith criticizes the notion, as common in his time as in ours, that money is the same thing as wealth. The wealth of a country, he points out, consists of the product of its natural resources and collective labor. In the terms I've sketched out in the previous chapter, it's the sum total of the goods and services produced by a nation's primary and secondary economies. In another place, though, he defines wealth as anything that can be valued in money. These definitions do not conflict with one another. Rather, they make the crucial point that money is not wealth, but the yardstick by which modern cultures measure wealth. This ought to be the first thing we teach children about money, though of course it isn't. It probably ought to be the first thing we teach economists about money, too, but the power of Descartes' fallacy stands in the way. Money is a unit of measurement, so it's inherently easy to define, understand, and quantify. Real wealth is much less easy to force into the Procrustean bed of numbers. That's why we use money as a rough and ready way of sorting out the relative value of different kinds of wealth so they can be exchanged without too much trouble. Money is so convenient as a way of measuring wealth that it very often ends up eclipsing wealth. And this is why most economists nowadays, even when they think they're talking about wealth, are actually talking about money. This becomes especially problematic when, as so often happens, they start attributing to wealth characteristics that are only true of money. This habit of thought pervades contemporary economics. For a crucial example, already mentioned, watch the way most economists these days brush aside the immense challenge of peak oil with the assurance that if oil ever does get scarce, the market will come up with alternatives. Implicit in this claim is the assumption that any energy source is as good as any other, and that the total amount in the system is effectively unlimited. This is true of money, at least in theory. $1 bill is worth exactly the same amount as any other, and the total number of dollars in circulation is as close to limitless these days as the printing presses of the U.S. Treasury can make it. But it is emphatically not true of energy resources, or of any other form of wealth. Compare any two energy resources in practical terms, and it's clear that in most cases, they're not even apples and oranges. They're apples and orangutans. Take petroleum and solar energy as good examples. A highly concentrated form of chemical energy and a rather diffuse form of electromagnetic energy have very little in common. And even when they can do the same things, you can heat a house with passive solar design, for example, or you can heat it with a oil-fired burner, the technologies are totally different. Easy talk about swapping one for the other thus evades the immense challenge and nearly unimaginable cost of scrapping multiple continent-wide infrastructures geared to oil and building new ones suited to solar energy. There are plenty of other questions ducked by talk of that kind, but this one will do for now. Presumably, an economist would notice something odd if he sat down at the lunch counter, ordered the daily special, and was handed instead a box of socket wrenches, even if the price of the wrenches was exactly the same as the daily special. If the economist was starving on a desert island and a crate that washed ashore proved to contain socket wrenches rather than food, the difference would be a matter of life or death. This latter is uncomfortably close to our position just now, as the world's energy companies race each other and the clock to extract fossil fuels in nearly unimaginable volumes from the Earth's dwindling supplies. If we allow ourselves to wait until actual energy shortages begin to cripple our capacity to produce goods and services, it will be much too late to start retooling our civilizations for some other energy resource, even if one happens to turn up. Because a subculture of erudite scholars in the economics departments of universities have made a metaphysical error, treating quantitative measurements as the only thing that really exists, our civilization may have missed its chance to dodge disaster. It's hard to think of a better argument for the importance of metaphysics than that. Still, the problem sketched here extends much further, and the way in which money has metastasized in our society to become the measure of all things has become a massive, though unrecognized, barrier in the way of any attempt to improve a rapidly worsening situation. The metastasis of money. Perhaps the most important force behind the confusion of money and wealth is the way, discussed in Chapter 2, that money has metastasized so deeply into our economic life that it's nearly impossible to do much of anything without it. The economic textbooks you did your best not to read in school justify that ubiquity by a neat rhetorical trick. If you remember anything at all about that, it's probably that bit of rhetoric. It can be found in the canned explanation for why we use money, somewhere around page 6. It runs something like this. There's a plumber and a pig farmer who want to do business with one another, see? But the plumber's Jewish and the pig farmer has nothing to trade but pork. Add money and voila! The farmer sells his pork to other people and uses the proceeds to pay the plumber, who uses it to buy gefilte fish and matzah meal. Everyone's happy except, presumably, the pigs. It all seems very logical until you think about it for 10 seconds. Notice to start with how the explanation assumes that the plumber, the pig farmer, the purchasers of pork, the kosher deli, and everyone else are restricted to the specific kind of economic relationships that exist in, and only in, a money economy. None of them have access to any other means of exchange except barter, household economies, gift economies, and customary exchange economies, which between them accounted for most economic activity during most of human history, are all excluded from the story. Thus, the plumber doesn't, as most people did a century ago, benefit from a household economy that provides a great deal of his food, including small livestock in the back garden. The pig farmer doesn't, as most people did until as little as 50 years ago, do essentially all of his household repairs himself. Both of them are defined by a single function. The pig farmer can only produce pork, the plumber only plumbing. Nor do the farmer, the plumber, or anyone else have access to any of the immense variety of non-monetary systems of exchange human beings have used throughout history. Kung hunter-gatherers sharing out a wildebeest among band members according to traditional rules, Haida chiefs distributing blankets and salmon to all corners of a potlatch, and medieval peasants working a baron's d'immense lands for a set number of days each year to maintain their ownership of their own cottages and fields, all participated in flexible and effective systems of exchange that had nothing to do with money. Urban societies as complex as ancient Egypt got by entirely without money and still managed to keep plumbers, pig farmers, and a great many other occupational specialties gainfully employed for millennia. All that the textbook explanation proves, in other words, is that if you have a money economy, it probably does need some kind of money to make it work. This is not the conclusion the textbooks draw from the plumber and pig farmer, of course. With very few exceptions, they leap from their canned example to the claim that money must be essential to any economy worth the name, and the rest of the textbook proceeds to focus on theories about the behavior of money under the false impression that those theories deal with the behavior of wealth. The mistaken metaphysics discussed above plays a large role in fostering this misunderstanding, but the sheer pervasiveness of money in today's industrial economy also has a very significant role. For most people in the modern industrial world, the only way to get access to any kind of wealth, that is, any good or service, is to get access to money first and exchange the money for the wealth. This makes it all too easy to confuse money with wealth, and it also fosters the habit of thought that treats money as the driving force in economic life and thinks of wealth as a product of money rather than seeing money as an arbitrary measure of wealth. The thought experiment already mentioned of placing a plane load of economists on a desert island with $1 million each but no food or water is a good corrective to this delusion. Unfortunately, this same experiment is being tried on a much vaster scale by the world's industrial economies right now. We have 7 billion people on a planet with a finite and dwindling supply of the concentrated energy resources that are keeping most of them alive, and governments and businesses alike are acting as though the only possible difficulty in this situation is coming up with enough money to pay for investments in the energy industry. It should be obvious that no amount of money can overcome the natural laws that have placed hard limits on the amount of highly concentrated energy resources that happen to exist on our planet. This is not obvious to most people nowadays, however, because the metastasis of money throughout the economy has trained nearly all of us to think that if you have enough money, you can get whatever you want. The fact that the richest people in the world can put their entire fortunes into health care and still get old and die is one of the few persistent reminders that money cannot overcome the laws of nature or provide access to goods and services that don't exist. So how did money get transformed from a convenient yardstick for real wealth to the be-all and end-all of contemporary economic life? At least 3 factors were involved, 2 of them common to complex urban societies throughout history, 1 unique to ours. First, despite the drastic oversimplifications of the textbook examples cited earlier, it reflects a reality. A complex society can gain significant advantages from a medium of exchange that can be traded for any form of wealth. Even in societies where most goods and services are distributed by way of social networks, social consensus tends to establish certain trade goods, wampum shell strings among the First Nations of eastern North America, for instance, as a common measure for those goods and services that are exchanged in other ways. As a society becomes more complex and the division of labor among different crafts expands, some standard measure of wealth becomes more useful. While money itself was invented around 700 BCE by the ancient Greeks, other ways of measuring wealth for the sake of easy exchange had been in use in the Old World urban societies for millennia before then. Second, whenever common measures of wealth are controlled by institutions, those who manage those institutions become powerful and can be counted on to maintain and expand their power whenever possible. In ancient Egypt, for example, grain in temple warehouses provided the basic measure of wealth. As a result, the priests who controlled the stockpiled grain became a potent political force. In medieval Europe, when land was the basic measure of wealth, there's a reason we still call land real estate, as though all other wealth is unreal. The power of the feudal nobility derived directly from their control of land. Today, the governments that claim exclusive power to print and regulate money and the banks and financial corporations that manage most of society's money derive much of their effective power from their control over the medium of economic exchange and can be counted on to encourage the rest of society to rely ever more completely on the thing that gives them power. These 2 factors can be traced in the history of most of the complex urban societies of the past. What makes our civilization something of an extreme case is a 3rd factor. The extreme complexity of an economic system that has temporarily replaced the limited energy resources of other human societies with a torrent of cheap and abundant energy from fossil fuels. Ilya Prigogine, one of the most innovative physicists of recent years, showed via a series of dizzyingly complex equations that the flow of energy through a system increases the complexity of the system. Any doubt of the accuracy of his claim can be settled by regarding the economic history of the Western world from 1700 to the present. The societies over which the tsunami of the Industrial Revolution broke in the early 18th century were not unusually complex by the standards of past civilizations. Their own contemporaries in the Chinese and Ottoman empires considered Western Europeans, not without reason, to be grunting, smelly barbarians with few of the arts and graces of civilization. Fossil fuels may not have done anything about the gracelessness and the smell, but it certainly made up for any shortage in complexity. Until the dawn of the industrial age, as a general rule of thumb, some 90% of the inhabitants of any complex society worked in agriculture, providing the food and raw materials that supported themselves as well as the 10% who could be spared for other economic roles. By 1900, at the zenith of the age of coal, many nations in the industrial world had dropped the percentage of their workforce in agriculture below 50% and shifted the workers, thus freed up, into a broad arrangement or broad assortment of new economic roles. By 2000, buoyed by the much higher concentration and efficiency of petroleum, many industrial nations had dropped the percentage of their workforce in agriculture below 5%. With the other 95% filling newly invented roles in the most complex economies in the history of the planet. One consequence of this swift and unprecedented surge in complexity was the triumph of money over all other systems of exchange. When the vast majority of workers at every income level labored at tasks so specialized that their efforts only produced value when combined with those of hundreds or thousands of other workers, money provided the only way that could receive a return on their labor. When most of the customers for any given product had money and nothing else to exchange for it, buying products for money became standard. social networks of exchange, household economies, customary local exchanges, church and fraternal networks, shattered under the strain and were replaced by purely economic relationships, wage labor, shopping, public assistance, that could be denominated entirely in cash. The last 3 centuries of social and economic history are largely a chronicle of the results. If economists took a wider view of the history of their discipline than they generally do, they might have noticed that what most of them consider a fundamental feature of all economies worth studying, the centrality of money, is actually a unique feature of an economic era defined by unprecedented amounts of cheap energy. Since the fossil fuels that made that era possible are being extracted at a pace many times the rate at which new supplies are being discovered, current assumptions about the role of money in society may be in for a series of unexpected revisions. In an ironic way, this process of revision may be fostered by the antics of the world's industrial nations as they try to forestall the Great Recession by spending money they don't have. The economic crisis that gripped the world in 2008 was primarily driven by a drastic mismatch between money and wealth. When the price of a rundown suburban house zoomed from $75,000 to $575,000, for example, the change marked a distortion in the yardstick rather than any actual increase in the wealth being measured. That distortion caused every economic decision based on it, for example, a buyer's willingness to go over his head into debt to buy the house, or a bank's willingness to lend money on the basis of imaginary equity, to suffer similar delusions. Now that the yardsticks have snapped back to something like their proper length, the results of the distortion have to be cleared out of the economy if the amount of money in the system is once again to reflect the actual amount of wealth. Yet this is exactly what governments and businesses across the industrial world are doing their best to forestall. Governments are scrambling to drive economic activity at a pace the real wealth of their societies can no longer support. Banks and businesses are doing everything in their power to divert attention from the fact that a great many of the financial assets propped up in their balance sheets were never worth anything in the first place, and now, if possible, are worth even less. Both are doing so by the simple expedient of spending money they don't have. As government deficits worldwide spin out of control, and the total notional value of the world's financial paper climbs steadily into the blue sky on the far side of the $1 quadrillion mark, the decoupling of money from wealth is even more extreme than it was at the height of the real estate bubble. This is another context in which a wider view of history than economists usually allow themselves to take could offer a useful warning. The dominance of money in complex societies has a distinctive trajectory over time, and that trajectory promises to unfold in ways that will overturn many of the assumptions of conventional economics in the decades ahead. It's ironic to note that this trajectory was first, and in many ways most usefully traced, by a nearly forgotten intellectual who had essentially no interest in the field of economics at all. The Flight into Abstraction. Giambattista Vico, who lived from 1668 to 1744, spent his career as a teacher of rhetoric at the University of Naples and devoted his off hours to one of the great intellectual projects of his time. His masterpiece, Principles of a New Science Concerning the Common Nature of Nations, appeared in 3 editions of increasing complexity, the last one after his death, and was almost completely ignored for most of a century thereafter. When it finally found its audience in the mid-19th century, its influence was profound and continues to this day. The New Science, as the work is generally known, was nothing less than the first modern attempt to make sense of the laws governing history. Vico was perhaps the first modern Western thinker to recognize the parallel historical trajectories of his own society and that of classical Greece and Rome. Using those as his 2 test cases, he attempted to sketch out, quote, the course the nations run, unquote, the process by which a society rises from barbarism to civilization and falls back to barbarism again. With only 2 examples to work from, Vico inevitably jumped to many conclusions that don't hold up well in the light of a broader view of world history, but some of his ideas are astonishingly prescient. and his basic intuition that societies go through broadly similar stages on the way from their initial rise to their final collapse remains central to any attempt to make sense of history on the grand scale. Vico's argument is complex and difficult to summarize, but one of its core themes is the role of abstraction. In the early days of a culture, Vico pointed out, a wide range of social phenomena focus entirely on specific concrete realities. But these phenomena evolve toward abstraction over the lifespan of the culture. Law codes start out as lists of rules for specific cases and broaden into statements of principles covering infinite variation in practice. Words leave behind concrete meanings. How many people nowadays recall that the verb understand once meant literally to stand under, in the sense of upholding or supporting something, and take on ever more nuanced meanings. Religion begins in the shattering impact of the numinous on individual lives and diffuses into elegant theological notions disconnected from the realities of human experience. So too, economics. Vico only gives the economic sphere the briefest of mentions in his work. As a scholar of rhetoric and law, his interests lay elsewhere. But the economic history of the Western world fits his scheme precisely. The cultures that clawed their way back up from the chaos that followed the fall of Rome knew only one form of real wealth, and that was agricultural land. The warrior aristocracies that threw back the last barbarian invasions from Europe and imposed a tenuous peace on their battered societies defined themselves by their landholdings. Possession of a knight's fee, enough land to support a single armored horseman, was the one requirement of noble status in those days. Money existed in the form of coinage, but it had a tiny economic role, and nearly all goods and services moved through customary patterns of exchange in which market forces had no place. The waning of the Middle Ages saw the gradual replacement of these customary economies with a new economics of precious metal currency. Feudal tenure, by which farmers held the right to their land in exchange for specific duties defined by tradition, gave way to cash rents, and a significant part of the population moved away from the land to proto-industrial wage labor in the newly expanding cities. This was a step toward abstraction. Gold and silver coins replaced fields of grain as the basic definition of wealth and made way for concentrations of economic power far more extreme than anything the Middle Ages had seen. Further abstractions followed. By the 17th century, banks began to issue paper receipts for the gold and silver in their vaults, and these receipts could be exchanged like the coinage that backed them. The invention of the banknote was followed promptly by the practice of printing more banknotes than a bank's gold and silver reserves would cover, on the assumption that most of the notes would never be cashed in for metal. When word of this practice spread, the first bank runs followed. In the same way, companies found that they could bring in capital by selling shares of their future earnings. The purchasers of these shares then found that their prices could be bid up or down, and stock speculation was born. Fast forward a few more centuries, and we arrive at today's global economy, which consists primarily of the buying and selling of abstractions. The concept of wealth, which was once limited to the immediate means of production and then shifted to mean the precious metal markers used to denominate the value of production, has now mutated into arbitrary numbers that can be wished into existence by a few keystrokes. When the U.S. government responded to the implosion of financial firms in 2009 by investing $250 billion in the nation's banks, for example, that money did not have to be pulled out of some bank account in the nation's name, much less extracted from the dwindling productive capacities of America's remaining factories and farms. It was conjured into being by government fiat, in order to replace some even vaster sum of abstract wealth that was more or less dissolved into twinkle dust over the preceding weeks. What makes this pursuit of the abstract so dangerous, of course, is that the abstract value of the tertiary economy is not the same thing as the concrete realities of the primary and secondary economies it once represented. Green fields and grain and storehouses, strong muscles and the work they accomplish, or for that matter, factories, the resources that keep them running and the products that come from them. These are real wealth. The layers of economic abstraction piled atop them are simply complex social games that determine who gets access to how much of this real wealth. And those games can be so complex and so dysfunctional that they get in the way of the production of real wealth. The flight into abstraction can proceed so far, in other words, that the abstractions interfere with the concrete realities underlying them. This possibility became appallingly real during a few weeks of 2009. The overnight interbank loan market, an economic abstraction so arcane that not even economists can explain its function in ordinary English, froze up. Desperation moves by the world's central banks managed to prevent a full-scale collapse, but stock markets worldwide panicked and crashed, erasing trillions of dollars in tertiary wealth in a single week. A stock market crash, it bears remembering, does not cause crop failures, labor shortages, or the destruction of industrial machinery. Its impact is purely on the tertiary economy of abstractions built atop the real primary and secondary wealth of land, labor, and industrial plant. Yet that impact can be devastating. In the depths of the last Great Depression, for example, the production of goods shrank to a small fraction of what it had been before the 1929 crash. U.S. production of steel, for example, bottomed out in the summer of 1932 at 12% of capacity. There was still plenty of land, plenty of laborers, and plenty of machines, not to mention millions of families whose breadwinners would have liked nothing so much as a chance to earn money and buy products. The only thing that could not be made to work was the market where abstractions were bought and sold, and without its help, the real economy ground to a halt. We are facing the same situation now, and official attempts to stabilize the economy are failing because they focus on the abstractions rather than the realities underlying them. The $250 billion just mentioned, for example, need not have been poured down a Wall Street rat hole. It could, for example, have been used to pay for the rebuilding of America's rail network, with the dramatic positive effects that would have resonated throughout the economy. That project would have hired hundreds of thousands of workers across the spectrum of skilled and unskilled trades. Locomotives and rolling stock would have to be built, countless miles of track laid and upgraded, stations repaired or built from scratch, and every dollar spent on all these things would ripple outward through the economy, supporting businesses of every kind and refinancing local banks with deposits rather than loans. Projects of the same kind played a large role in helping many countries in the 1930s begin to pull themselves out of the morass of the last Great Depression. Instead, the $250 billion was assigned the task of making up for a portion of the imaginary wealth that had already evaporated from the balance sheets of banks. Abstraction had triumphed over economic realities, and the multiple impacts of that failure of imagination will be with us for a very long time to come. Yet the richest irony of that process is that, as Vico himself would have been the first to point out, this unparalleled expenditure of abstract wealth has helped drive changes with many parallels in the declining civilizations of the past. The Twilight of Money. One of the least constructive habits of contemporary thought is its unwillingness to grapple with this last point, and that habit has its roots in the common contemporary insistence on the uniqueness of the modern experience. It's true, of course, that fossil fuels have allowed the world's industrial societies to pursue their follies on a more grandiose scale than any past empire has managed, but the follies themselves closely parallel those of previous societies. A difference of scale does not necessarily equal a difference in kind. Tracking the trajectories of past examples of economic folly is one of the few available sources of guidance if we want to know where the current versions of this phenomenon, or these phenomenon, are headed. The metastasis of money through every aspect of life in the modern industrial world is a good example. While no past society, as far as we know, took this process as far as we have, the replacement of wealth with its own abstract representations is no new thing. As we've seen, Vico pointed out back in the 18th century that complex societies move from the concrete to the abstract over their life cycles. This movement toward abstraction has important advantages for complex societies because abstractions can be deployed with a much smaller investment of resources than it takes to mobilize the concrete realities that back them up. We could have resolved 2008's debate about who should rule the United States the old-fashioned way, for example, by having McCain and Obama call their supporters to arms, march to war, and settle the matter in a pitched battle amid a hail of bullets and cannon shot on a fine September day on some Iowa prairie. The cost in lives, money, and collateral damage, however, would have been far in excess of those involved in an election. In much the same way, the complexities involved in paying office workers in kind, or even in cash, makes an economy of abstractions much less cumbersome for all concerned. At the same time, there's a trap hidden in the convenience of abstractions. The further you get from the concrete realities, the larger the chance becomes that those concrete realities may not actually be there when needed. History is littered with the corpses of regimes that let their power become so abstract that they could no longer counter a challenge on the fundamental level of raw violence. It's been said of Chinese history, and could be said of that of any other civilization, that its basic rhythm is the tramp of hobnobbed boots going upstairs, followed by the whisper of silk slippers going back down. In the same way, economic abstractions keep functioning only so long as actual goods and services exist to be bought and sold. And it's only in the pipe dreams of economists that abstractions guarantee the presence of the goods and services. Vico argued that this trap is a central driving force behind the decline and fall of civilizations. The movement toward abstraction goes so far that the concrete realities are neglected. That's key. Vico argued that this trap is a central driving force behind the decline and fall of civilizations. The movement toward abstraction goes so far that the concrete realities are neglected. In the end, the realities trickle away unnoticed, until a shock of some kind strikes the tower of abstractions built atop the void the realities once filled, and the whole structure tumbles to the ground. We are uncomfortably close to such a possibility just now, especially in our economic affairs. Over the last century, with the assistance of the economic hypercomplexity made possible by fossil fuels, the world's industrial nations have taken the process of economic abstraction further than any previous civilization. On top of the usual levels of abstraction, a commodity used to measure value, gold, receipts that could be exchanged for that commodity, paper money, and promises to pay the receipts, checks, and other financial paper, contemporary societies have built an extraordinary pyramid of additional abstractions. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt, furthermore, this one has a narrow end on the ground in the realm of actual goods and services, and widens as it goes up. The consequence of all this pyramid building is that there are not enough goods and services on Earth to equal, at current prices, more than a small percentage of the face value of the stocks, bonds, derivatives, and other fiscal exotica now in circulation. The vast majority of economic activity in today's world consists purely of exchanges among these representations of wealth. This is why the real economy of goods and services can go into a free fall like the one now underway, without having more than a modest impact, so far at least, on an increasingly hallucinatory tertiary economy of fiscal abstractions. Yet an impact it will have if the free fall proceeds far enough. This was Vico's point, and it's a possibility that has been taken far too lightly both by the political classes of today's industrial societies and by their critics on either end of the political spectrum. An economy of hallucinated wealth depends utterly on the willingness of all participants to pretend that the hallucinations have real value. When that willingness slackens, the pretense can evaporate in record time. This is how financial bubbles turn into financial panics. The collective fantasy of value that surrounds tulip bulbs or stocks or suburban tract housing or any other speculative vehicle dissolves into a mad rush for the exits. That rush has been peaceful to date, but it need not always be. The money bubble. I've argued that the industrial age is in some sense the ultimate speculative bubble, a 3-century-long binge driven by the fantasy of infinite economic growth on a finite planet with even more finite supplies of cheap, abundant energy. Still, it's important to realize that this mega bubble has spawned a second bubble on an even larger scale. The vehicle for this secondary mega bubble is money, more precisely, the entire profusion of abstract representations of wealth that dominate our economic life and have all but smothered the real economy of goods and services, to say nothing of the primary economy of natural systems that keeps all of us alive. Speculative bubbles are defined in various ways, but classic examples, the 1929 stock binge, say, or the late housing bubble, have certain standard features in common. First, the value of whatever item is at the center of the bubble shows a sustained rise in price, not justified by changes in the wider economy or in any concrete value the item may have. The speculative bubble in money functions a little differently than other bubbles because the speculative vehicle is also the measure of value. Instead of $1 increasing in value until it's worth $2, $1 becomes $2. Whereas stocks or tract houses go zooming up in price when a bubble focuses on them, what climbs in a money bubble is the total amount of paper wealth in circulation. That certainly happened in recent decades. A second standard feature of speculative bubbles is that they absorb most of the fictive value they create, rather than spilling it back into the rest of the economy. In a stock bubble, for example, a majority of the money that comes from stock sales goes right back into the market. Without this feedback loop, a bubble can't sustain itself for long. In a money bubble, this same rule holds good. Most of the paper earnings generated by the bubble end up being reinvested in some other form of paper wealth. Here again, this has certainly happened. The only reason we haven't seen 1,000% inflation as a result of the vast manufacture of paper wealth in recent decades is that most of it has been used solely to buy even more newly manufactured paper wealth. A third standard feature of speculative bubbles is that the number of people involved in them climbs steadily as the bubble proceeds. In 1929, the stock market was deluged by amateur investors who had never before bought a share of anything. In 2006, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people who previously thought of houses only as something to live in, came to think of them as a ticket to overnight wealth and sank their net worth in real estate as a result. The metastasis of the money economy discussed earlier is another example of this same process at work. Finally, of course, bubbles always pop. When that happens, the speculative vehicle du jour comes crashing back to earth, losing the great majority of its assumed value, and the mass of amateur investors, having lost anything they made, and usually a great deal more, trickle away from the market. This has not yet happened to the current money bubble. It might be a good idea to start thinking about what might happen if it does. The effects of a money panic would be focused uncomfortably close to home, I suspect, because the bulk of the hyperextension of money in recent decades has focused on a single currency, the U.S. dollar. That bomb might have been diffused if the collapse of the housing bubble in 2008 had been allowed to run its course, because this would have eliminated no small amount of the dollar-denominated abstractions generated by the excesses of recent years. Unfortunately, the U.S. government chose instead to try to reinflate the bubble economy by spending money it didn't have, through an orgy of borrowing and some very dubious gimmickry. A great many foreign governments are accordingly becoming reluctant to lend the U.S. more money, and at least one rising power, China, has been quietly cashing in its dollar reserves for commodities and other forms of far less abstract wealth. Up until now, it has been in the best interests of other industrial nations to prop up the United States with a steady stream of credit, so that it can bankrupt itself by fulfilling its self-imposed role as global policeman. It's been a very comfortable arrangement, since other nations haven't had to shoulder the costs of dealing with rogue states, keeping the Middle East divided against itself, or maintaining economic hegemony over an increasingly restive third world, while they still receive the benefits of all those policies. The end of the age of cheap fossil fuel, however, has thrown a wild card into the game. As world petroleum production falters, it must have occurred to the leaders of other nations that if the United States no longer consumed roughly a quarter of the world's fossil fuel supply, there would be a great deal more for everyone else to share out. The possibility that other nations might decide that this potential gain outweighs the advantages of keeping the United States solvent may make the next decade or so interesting, in the sense of the famous Chinese curse. Over the longer term, it's safe to assume that the vast majority of paper assets now in circulation, whatever the currency in which they're denominated, will lose all their value. This might happen quickly, or it might unfold over decades, but the world's supply of abstract representations of wealth is so much vaster than its supply of concrete wealth that something has to give sooner or later. Future economic growth won't make up the difference. The end of the age of cheap fossil fuel makes growth in the real economy of goods and services a thing of the past, outside of rare and self-limiting situations. As the limits to growth tighten and become first barriers to growth and then drivers of contraction, shrinkage in the real economy will become the rule, heightening the mismatch between money and wealth and increasing the pressure toward depreciation of the real value of paper assets. Once again, though, all this has happened before. Just as increasing economic abstraction is a common feature of the growth of complex societies, the unraveling of that abstraction is a common feature of their decline and fall. The desperate expedients now being pursued to expand the American money supply in a rapidly contracting economy have exact equivalents in, say, the equally desperate measures taken by the Roman Empire in its last years to expand its own money supply by debasing its coinage. The Roman economy achieved very high levels of complexity and an international reach. Its moneylenders, we would call them financiers today, were a major economic force, and credit played a sizable role in everyday economic life. In the decline and fall of the empire, all this went away. The farmers who pastured their sheep in the ruins of Rome's Forum during the Dark Ages, as we've seen, lived in an economy of barter and feudal custom, in which coins were rare items more often used as jewelry than as a medium of exchange. A similar trajectory almost certainly waits in the future of our own economic system, though what use the shepherds who pasture their flocks on the mall in the ruins of a future Washington, D.C., will find for vast stacks of treasury bills is by no means clear. How the trajectory will unfold is anyone's guess, but the possibility that we may see sharp declines in the value of the dollar and of dollar-denominated paper assets probably should not be ignored. And cashing in abstract representations of wealth for things of more enduring value might well belong high on the list of sensible preparations for the future. The end of investment. Many people nowadays, of course, assume that collecting large amounts of money is the best preparation for a difficult future. The thought experiment of the economists on the desert island, though, points to the core problem with that easy assumption. Grant for a moment that the island has a water supply and enough natural foodstuffs that the economists don't have to worry about starving to death. Will the economists on the island have a standard of living corresponding to the $1 million they each have with them? Of course not. Their prosperity will be measured by the breadfruit they pick, the fish they catch, the huts they make, and so on. Once again, money is not wealth. It is a measure of wealth, and it also functions as a social mechanism for distributing wealth. It means nothing unless there is real wealth, actual, non-financial goods and services produced by the primary and secondary economies to back it up. In a healthy market economy, there's a rough balance between the amount of money in circulation and the amount of real wealth produced annually, and so the confusion between money and wealth can slip by unnoticed. When money and wealth get out of sync with one another, problems sprout. The economic history of the 19th century offers a good example. The rising industrial economy of the time drove a massive increase in the production of real wealth. Most industrial nations, though, inherited money systems backed by gold reserves that offered few options for expanding the money supply to match the supply of real wealth. The result was a deflationary spiral that brought major economic depressions every couple of decades for most of the century. In response, in the 20th century, nation after nation abandoned the gold standard straitjacket and retooled their money system to meet the needs of an expanding economy. That's the context of the present crisis because, in terms of real wealth, we no longer have an expanding economy. The production of real wealth in the world's industrial nations has been in decline now for decades. Some of the deficit has been made up by importing real wealth from overseas, but not all. Compare the lifestyle available to a single-salary working-class American family in 1969 to the lifestyle available to a similar family today, and it's possible to get a glimpse of just how much stealth impoverishment has taken place over the last 40 years. This impoverishment went unnoticed by most people because the money supply didn't follow suit. Until the economy came unglued in the second half of 2008, money, most of it to be sure in the form of unearned credit and unsecured debt, had never been so abundant or readily available. Some of it got spent on real wealth, which is why real estate and other commodities soared to giddy heights. But most of it was diverted instead into various forms of abstract tertiary wealth. Those have become the basis for the most vaporous dimension of today's contemporary life, the world of investment. The confusion between money and wealth and the biases imposed by the long economic expansion of industrialism have made it almost impossible to talk sensibly about investments these days. To most people nowadays, it seems perfectly reasonable to think that under normal circumstances, $1 invested today should always yield more than $1 tomorrow. In an expanding economy, this is true more often than not. And since people in the industrial world have been living in expanding economies since time out of mind, it seems like a law of nature that money ought to make money. The long economic expansion of the industrial age has thus fostered the massive expansion of what old-fashioned Marxists used to call the rentier class, a class whose money makes money for them. Even among people who work for a living, the idea of joining the rentier class on retirement and living comfortably off investments has become very popular in recent years. The problem, of course, is that the age of industrial expansion is over. It was made possible in the first place only by exponentially increasing the use of fossil fuels and other natural resources. Like all exponential growth curves, it faces an inevitable collision with the limits of its own environment. And that collision is happening around us right now. We are thus entering a period of prolonged economic contraction, not a recession or even a depression, but a change in the fundamental dynamic of the economy. Over the centuries just past, a rising tide of economic growth was interrupted by occasional periods of contraction. Over the centuries ahead, the long decline of the industrial economy will doubtless be interrupted by occasional periods of relative prosperity. Just as a rising tide lifts all boats, a falling tide lowers them all. And if the tide goes out far enough, a great many boats will end up high and dry. The result is that money can no longer be counted on to make money. And as this becomes apparent, the basis for most of today's rentier class will go out of existence. Members of the rentier class, whether they earn all their living or only part of it from investments, have made desperate attempts to avoid dealing with this unwelcome reality. These attempts, however, have had the ironic result of making the situation much worse than it had to be. As actual investments in productive economic activities stopped yielding a noticeable profit, more and more investors sought to make money by means of speculation, calling into being a menagerie of exotic financial livestock notable for its complete disconnection from the economy of goods and services. The result was a series of classic speculative bubbles, culminating in the crash of 2008 and the crisis still unfolding around us as I write this. In the process, eager investors who might have lost their money slowly over a period of years have instead lost it all at once. At this point, the twilight of investment is very nearly upon us. Most of the assets that attract the attention of investors and speculators alike, from stocks, bonds, and mutual funds right up to the most exotic class of derivatives, are part of the torrent of unpayable debt presently flooding the global economy, and the rest are priced at levels that assume that most, if not all, of that unpayable debt can still be cashed in for goods and services. One way or another, those assets will sooner or later move toward their real value, which, in the case of speculative assets, is nothing, and in the case of productive assets is much less than they're worth on paper right now. This means that, on average, investments will tend to lose money for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, this is likely to be true even of vital commodities such as crude oil. 2008's price spikes in oil and other energy resources were only partly a product of geological limits. The soaring demand of an overheating economy and speculative money flooding into any asset that was gaining in price both played major parts. Prices collapsed when the speculative money flowed back out, and slumping demand has helped keep prices well below their 2008 peaks since then. As the economy unravels further, the chance of further declines can't be dismissed. It has too rarely been noticed that there are at least two ways to price oil out of the market. The first is for the price per barrel to soar out of reach, while the second is for the economy to contract so sharply that even a low price per barrel is more than most people can pay. The twilight of investment is one example of the way that metaphysical abstractions woven into the way we think about money can have profoundly concrete impacts on everyday life. Let me say that again. The twilight of investment is one example of the way that metaphysical abstractions woven into the way we think about money can have profoundly concrete impacts on daily life. A far more important example, however, can be traced in the mismatch between contemporary economics and the realities of energy. Only by grasping the difference between how energy works and how economists think it works is it possible to grasp the shape of the predicament of industrial society in any meaningful way, and begin to see how that predicament might be faced.
That's the end of Chapter 3 of John Michael Greer's 2011 book, The Wealth of Nature. Continue to Part 4 on YouTube for Chapter 4.